So, Prof, Prof, you start by telling us about yourself that other people does not know.
Hmm, what a question. How do I introduce myself? Well, I doubt whether there's anything else that I would
Okay.
like to say about myself that people don't know. I've been around for a while, I believe. Um, Starting from my days as a journalist in Nigeria. Sometimes people forget I was a journalist, especially people who have had to know my later part, as an academic.
Okay.
So I started. I went to school in various parts of Nigeria. I started my primary school, or rather, I had part of my primary school in Kano,
Okay.
Nigeria, where I was born, part in my hometown in Obashugu in Delta State.
Okay.
And then I did my A levels in Aba at Federal School of Arts and Science, Aba.
Oh,
And from there, I went to the University of Ibadan, where I did my first degree and my master's. And
wonderful.
then after that, I started working as a journalist in Nigeria. And I like to say that I have a cockroach eye view of Nigerian media, borrowing from Dambuzo Marachera,
Okay.
not from bedding in people's houses or bedding in, because Dambuzo says from bedding in people's houses. This is from working in so many media houses.
Okay.
So I started at The Guardian, went through media houses in Ibadan. I worked at Third Eye, and then, to working in magazines, and so on. So I think I worked in about 7 to 9 media houses, and that gave me extensive view of Nigerian media.
Oh,
So beyond that, I decided to go back. Within the period, of course, my very strong interest in academia in existed. So I taught at the University of Ibadan as a part-time lecturer, or what we call adjunct,
okay.
for 1 year.
Okay.
And then within that was while I was still working as a journalist. At some point, I started working as a consulting editor for newspapers, no more as a full-time staff.
Okay.
And the highlight of my career as a journalist was the Post Express literary supplement, which I founded and edited for a number of years in the 90s, and that was quite influential at the time.
Okay.
And then I became general secretary of the Association of Nigerian Authors. I was the general secretary for 4 years, during which I tried to the association in direction,
Okay.
some of which has disappeared. And part of my highlight of my activism in the cultural politics of Nigeria
Okay.
is my role as a founding member of the board of the Nigerian Prize for Literature.
Oh,
I played a very key role. I played a significant role in the founding of the prize.
okay.
I actually provided the initial guidelines for prize, which was discussed by the board.
Oh,
And then in 2006, I decided to relocate to Canada, my PhD,
oh.
and the rest, they say, is history, because I remained. I went to the States after my PhD to work with the great Ugonabo,
Hmm.
the venerable Chino Achebe, Professor Chino Achebe. I worked with him for 1 year at Brown University,
Wow.
where I did my
Beautiful.
postdoc and then also served as senior research assistant to him. That has been one of the watersheds in my life, working with him around. And then I won the Banting Postdoctoral Fellowship,
Okay. Oh.
Canada's most prestigious postdoctoral fellowship, back to Canada.
Hmm.
And happily so, because my family and I preferred to live in Canada. So that's where we are. And then I got appointed to the Institute of African Studies. I was retained, track professor, and then in tenure, then I continued to work at Carleton University's Institute of African Studies, and continue in my various lives as an academic, as a writer, and to some extent as a journalist, and very much so involved in molding minds, young people, and then also in contributing to literary intellectual debates across various.
Wow.
That,
That is a very oh why that is a wonderful one, Prof. I admire your, will I say, tenacity, your courage, and your zeal for knowledge. And there's something I really admire about you, since we have been friends on Facebook, and I see the way you love education so well. You love writing. You feel it on you. It's on you. Everything about writing is you. You understand? I have seen everything about the way you write, the way you post things you share on Facebook, on platforms. I'm like, Prof, this is something wonderful. Like, ah, something so great and something to elevate us with the coming up writers, someone like me. Understand? So I appreciate everything, all the effort you have put to literature in Nigeria as a whole, and we really do appreciate. So thank you very much, sir. Thank you for that wonderful.
my
Will I
pleasure.
call it autobiography or biography? Okay. So we move to the next question, Prof. Let's talk about your book or your recent book, Displace, the Poetry of Nduka Otiono. What is all about?
I have, over the years, I have written poetry,
Okay.
but I was answering a rather very tricky question recently. What was at what point was, like an idea that made me become a poet, and I couldn't write. It was a question I couldn't answer easily.
Okay.
Not many people can actually answer that. And so I've been writing poetry for as long as I can remember, dating back to the period when I wrote love letters for one of my senior cousins those
Okay.
days, back in Obashuku, my hometown.
Hmm.
And, he used to, I wrote letters for a few people, then especially seniors who were wooing young women at the time.
Hmm.
And they were fascinated by my cursive handwriting and also what they thought was my dexterity with language. And so in those love letters, there were some kind of poems, right? I used them, but as I developed, and I also am able to write, fortunately, write fiction. But I had read one thing that Scott Fitzgerald had said about some gems, sublime gems, sublime lines. If you write fiction, and especially if you're a journalist, as I was,
Okay.
writing every day compulsively, meeting deadlines, generating story ideas. And then you're also a writer, an academic. I don't know about other people. I face a certain kind of conflict that agonize all the time. What do you do with those beautiful lines that come to you even when you're writing journalistic pieces, right? I thought without necessarily assuming that journalism is an inferior form of writing, but that there were some precious touchstones. I think that's what Longinus calls it. They're those touchstones, those gems of lines. That you heard them. You know what I mean? I'm sure most of you here are writers.
Yeah.
You know what happens when you have this fine line and you're like, no, I can't just waste this line.
This line. Let me write write something
I
down.
have to think about where I am going to plug it in, to
Yeah.
use
Plug it
one
in.
cliche from contemporary Nigerian cultural expression.
Yeah.
And so I dealt with poetry held, the most effective way of communicating my feelings. So this book, that is called
Displace.
Displace.
Yeah.
And now that I have opportunity, it's not all the time that you have to pronounce it or call it.
Yeah.
It is Displace. It is not Displace, which is
Okay.
a normal, the
Normal.
accent is different,
Oh, okay.
because this is a play on the words this and place from Nigerian Pidgin.
Pidgin,
And
right.
then also from the so-called standard English.
Okay.
And so this collection around the time of COVID, within this COVID season in 2020. I started looking back, and I was into correspondence with Chris Dunton. And, I had been on some projects. I've had a season of very effective flowering. And so the projects have been rolling. And I thought, okay, what do I do? I started reading some of these my old collections, and I like them. And we came up with the idea of doing a new and selected poems.
Wow.
And that gave birth to this. So this has poems selected from my first collection of poems, which was was runner-up, for the Anna Prize, Voices in the Rainbow. And then my second collection of poems, Love in a Time of Nightmares, and then my new poems. So that's what is contained in this book. And I was processing this whole idea for this new book and thought about pitching it with publishers, and was fortunate that Wilfrid Laurier University Press accepted to publish it as part of Canada's most prestigious poetry series, the Laurier Poetry Series.
Beautiful.
So that is the background to Displace.
Wow, that is wonderful. Although I haven't gotten a copy for it, but we'll find a way to get that. I think we have discussed about how to get a copy of that, and you explain things to me. So the board are going to check of how to get a copy and read them and read the book rather. On that aspect about the same book, let me paraphrase on this one. The last time you spoke with choice360.org, you mentioned about something that I wanted to really ask you about. Is you said a poet does not edit his own work. That is problematic. I really want to know, how is it problematic, and don't you think that it gives more insight for the poet?
I think you must be misrepresenting me in that quotation.
Okay.
I can't remember the exact lines, but the discussion was around working with an editor.
Okay.
So the editor of this book is my very good friend Peter Midgley, who himself is a poet and a professional editor. He used to be the acquisition editor for University of Alberta Press. So he is a very distinguished literary personality in Canada. And he is also African. He's originally, as we say here, from Namibia.
Okay.
And so he is an immigrant himself. And we're talking about working with an editor.
Okay.
And I think, it was what kind of contribution he had made to the editing.
Okay.
And so I was talking in the context of an editor editing poetry.
Okay.
That's the podcast. I know the podcast you're talking about.
Okay.
So the point I make is that I think it would even be better to just get the full podcast or that section of it so that I can clarify it. Yeah. But it is not that a poet cannot edit himself, no, far from it.
Okay.
Because in this book, I actually, also say that a poem is hardly finished.
Okay.
And some of you know, if you're like me, who is very finicky about so many things, and who strives as much as they say towards perfection.
Yeah.
Sometimes you have to physically wrest a work from me before it's finished.
Okay.
Like it's just never finished. And I am not alone in it. I think some people share the same kind of attitude. So the point about editing is how troubling it is to edit. Even editing, you can edit to the extent that you over edit. And then, having somebody else also edit your work, a poet edit your work. That's the point I was trying to make, or that I made there. Okay. You run the risk of a poet imposing their own style on your work.
Okay.
And it's not just poetry. I think in all forms of writing, there are some idiosyncratic kinds of forms of writing that you could give to somebody else to edit, and they will impose their own style on your style. And I'll give you an example of one writer that I used to find a bit frustrating editing. Not because he didn't write well or anything, but because he had an idiosyncratic paragraph style. No, I think, and that's Tony Khan. Tony Khan has developed a style of writing very short paragraphs. And so if you approach it from a different perspective, a different stylistic perspective, you're going to be feeling like, this paragraph is too short. I think you should join this paragraph to this and make. And then before long, especially when you start, you would have found yourself in a situation where you start editing a work and realize, I think I'm just messing up. This is this person's style, and I should let it stand. If you quarrel with it, that's a different thing. So that's the danger in it. Peter Midgley is a poet, and I was saying about how problematic it could be if you also have a poet within another poet. But that wasn't the case with this collection, because very experienced editors like Peter Midgley understand the nuances of style and understand the idiosyncrasies of style and understand what constitutes the editor's attention to a piece of work, a piece of creative writing, and what should be left to stand as a writer's, or otherwise having a conversation about whether this works or not. Because no matter the style that you adopt, it's still going to be assessed on its propriety, whether on its effectiveness. It's not just enough to assume that I'm going to adopt a specific style, and it doesn't work. So in my first book, this collection of short stories, I adopt a stream of consciousness. So as the night hides with a knife. A lot of these stories here will be problematic to some kind of editor, because I was under the influence of surrealism. And then, I had also been so closely attracted to the work of Dambuzo Marachera, especially in House of Hunger. So the passages here, I think one of my friends who read part of this, I saw him briefly here, was Ife Sinachi, Wadike, Jean Paul. Some of the sentences are fragmented. There's fragmentary aspect of the writing. And then it's highly elliptical in some passages. And you're going to say, no, this is frustrating. Why is this guy giving all these gaps? Why can't you fill it out? So that's exactly the context in which I speak about the danger of editing by another creative artist. However, they also do add value, because the creative artist, unlike the non-creative writer as an editor, do those kinds of idiosyncratic style, and may not also be able to add the kind of value that is necessary in assessing, say, a poetic work like Displace. So that's the point I was making, and I hope that I've been able to clarify that.
Yes, you have, Prof. You have really, really clarified that for me, and I really appreciate for that. To the next one, Prof. Do you think poetry is more important to our world today than prose?
What a question.
Yeah.
I wish I could answer that by yes or no, but that's a hard question. That's a question to answer on yes or no. I don't think any of them is more important. It depends on the writer's the writer's accessibility to any of those genres. Some people are poets, and some are novelists or short story writers or fiction writers, and then some are also playwrights, or dramatists, or dramaturgs. So in the various ways that people utilize their inspiration, it can't be assessed on the basis, or it can't be graded, that this is more important than the other, because there are ways in which poetry lends itself as the most immediate, most spontaneous, and the most emotive ways of dealing with any specific experience, in ways that fiction just might not be able to do that, and vice versa. If you're dealing with certain experiences that require extended exploration, then poetry might not be. However, that is only half the truth, because there are poems that are long poems that have been deployed in the same kind of way, in a similar way as fiction has been. So if you think, for example, of Derek Walcott's Omeros, you see an extended form that is in the epic tradition, where the poet explores life's experiences using that revisiting Homer, and adopting the Homeric verse form. You can also think about some other longer forms or longer poems.
Okay.
You think about the wasteland and so on and so forth. What Eliot does with the wasteland may not easily be done with a novel. And so that is the way I see my work as a writer, especially since I write fiction and poetry. I do not equate one, or I do not assign to one greater significance or more urgent significance. It depends on how the idea come to me, and what I believe is the best form to express it. It could even be creative nonfiction, which I have also worked in. However, it seems to me that given the challenges that we face in the world today, especially in part of the world that is called the third world or developing world, the existential challenges sometimes makes poetry for the writer who has the gift of poetry to engage in more spontaneous, urgent reflection, artistic reflection on experience, because the poem, is a short form that can be finished at a sitting. A novel is not necessarily so. Some kind of short stories might work in that kind of way. So every experience, becomes a grit for the writer. And it is left for the writer, depending on the kind of stream of influence, stream of inspiration that they have. And then also actually stream of influence that they have in terms of assessing their experience to determine what form is best suitable for capturing that experience or for enliving that experience, from lifting it from the abstract form to the more concrete form that we see in writing. So I can't assign any sense of graduation in terms of which is more important or relevant to today's world.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you, Prof, for that nice question. Stay on the
my pleasure.
On the issue of poetry, which is we are on literature. Let's on literature aspect. I want to know, sir, what are the difference between oral literature and written literature?
Oral literature and written literature.
Yes.
Okay. As you probably know, I am a big fan of oral literature and
also
actually
the
work in oral literature. Oral literature is, if you take the terms on their very literal, oral literature is literature that is oral.
Yes.
While written literature is textual literature. Literature is written. However, that would be a very simplistic definition of the two terms, because oral literature encompasses a very complex form of literary expression that is both verbal, textual, and also digital. Because we live in the digital age where what was traditionally and exclusively oral have been technologized, to use Walter Ong's very beautiful expression, and the word was technologized, the technologization of the word, which means the archiving of what would otherwise be a fleeting experience into digital formats that make them accessible and proceeds into what is called tertiary orality. So in discussing what oral literature is, we'll have to break them down into different levels of the most fundamental, which is the oral expression or the verbal expression of verbal parts. And then we think about its processing through the secondary form, and then now to the tertiary or technological formats. And so what you were referring to the last time was a podcast. But there are also poets here, and I have completed a digitization, not digitization now, the performance and an audio book of my poetry, which has not been released, which I hope to have released, with time. The first two collections are already digitized, where I have them in audiobooks. So, I have books that exist in audio format, which didn't used to be that way. So you have the immediacy of the performance, the context of performance, where you have an oral performance that is now, transformed or transformed, but stored in different retrieval systems, that are digital. So oral literature, we think more in terms of them with regards to verbal expression. So like folk tales and all of those, like the epic, which are accompanied by the raconteurs. You can say minstrels.
Okay.
You can think about the griots. You can think about a court historian. I recorded for my master's thesis at University of Ibadan an oral artist who was also a court historian and a fantastic performer. His name was Nweke Moma from Ubuluku in Delta State, Nigeria. And so his performance had to move from the format to a digital format at the time. He had an LP, which was recorded. And the best example of what I'm trying to describe, in terms of evoking or clarifying what we mean by oral literature and its various meaning dimensions would be J.P. Clark's Osidi Saga, which existed primarily as an oral performance. And then later as a film, because it was film. And then he also wrote a play out of it. So you can see the various dimensions of performance. Yeah. So we have different ways, and somebody had just posted that Henry Mesconic, said that orality is the strength of the language.
Yes.
The spontaneity part of it is what we think immediately when we think in terms of oral literature, but it's beyond that. And so understanding oral literature in its very complex form allows us to relate to it, especially something that originates from what is called an oral culture and often associated with pre-literate civilization as a way of recognizing its complexity and then also of understanding its evolution over time. With written literature, that becomes even far more complicated because how do you deal with oral literature that has become written? You know what I mean? So in discussions of one of the fascinating topics in oral literature is oral to written transformation. And I think is a academic Biakolo that also has an essay like that, Emewo Biakolo. But there's also, a number of texts, dealing with oral to written transformation. So we have the literary text, the oral, what I call written literature.
Yeah, written literature.
Well, despite the fact that we understand how an oral form can become written, can be trapped in the written form, we also do recognize that in terms of taxonomy, that written literature is seen as text that is produced essentially by writing. And this would include much of what we write these days. But there's also spoken word, which has become some kind of reincarnation, if I may use that word advisedly, of oral performance. So if we talk about oral literature, we cannot, delink it from oral performance. The oral performance. And that's something that is very vital. You might like to check out my story in this collection, The Night Hides with a Knife. It's called Wings of Rebellion, where I actually attempt a synthesis, as Professor Zevaye says, actually interprets in the foreword to this book. I attempt a synthesis of the scribal and the oral, or the oral and the scribal, where I have a story that is being told. The story is being performed at the same time, it's being told at the bar, and the entire context of the narrative itself and the context of performance are captured by the writer, by the author. Is in Wings of Rebellion here. That explains my fascination for the oral performance, oral literature, and scribal literature, or what you have called written literature, which is a more modern incarnation of an oral expression of the oral literary expression. So the new book that we published, Chiji Akuma, is called Oral Literary Performance Africa. In order to capture that complicated relationship between the oral and the written, between the verbal and the written, as part of this heritage of African literature.
Okay. Wow. So that is wonderful, sir. So thank you so much, Prof, for that. I think we should take some questions from audience. Let's ask if there's any question from the audience. Hello, everyone. Greetings. Is there any question? Do you have a question to ask? Hello, Sadi. Do you have a question to ask? Hello.
It's morning here, so I have my coffee. So
Hello.
Hello, Mr.
yes.
Gidi.
But yeah, I don't have a question, but I think I joined in when he was speaking, when the Prof was speaking about the editing. Can you hear me?
Yes, I am.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you. We can
Yes,
hear
we
you,
can
sir.
hear you.
We can hear you.
Okay, so when the Prof was speaking about creative,
Hello, can you hear me?
creatives, I think someone else is trying to speak.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, Sadi, we can hear you. We can hear you very well.
Somebody was speaking already.
Okay, I think
Hello.
we can hear you, Sadly. I think the next person is asking a question. Just give us some minutes.
So I joined in when the Prof was speaking about creatives, editing, and I actually enjoyed. I like that answer. So I just wanted to chip that in. I love the way he answered that particular question. Really, I also do some edit works, and what I try to do is I don't touch. I don't bother on
when you're done.
I don't try to alter the styles and even whatever the person is trying to, maybe the philosophies and all stuff is trying to. But I also at times find myself tempted because I'm looking at the way I would actually have written it. So I actually love your answers to that particular question. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Badmos. Really appreciate. Thank you so much for that question, for that contribution rather. So is there any other question, audience?
Yes. Permit me to contribute. So thank you so much, Prof, for the wonderful for explaining and for also answering those questions very well. So I'd like to begin with stating that in many cases, it's a common cliche that poetry is associated with pain and in some cases too with depression. So do you think that it's possible for a poet or an artist, a literary artist, to be detached from their arts emotionally? And what are some ways that you deal with the pain that comes with writing or crafting poetry, if this applies to you at all? Thank you.
Oh, wow. That's a very interesting question.
Nice question.
I have actually agonized a lot about which triggers poetry more, pain or pleasure, happiness, sadness or joy. And I believe so many other writers, so many other poets, especially, also agonize, not agonize, but think about how this operates in their consciousness, when they're writing. I do not have an easy answer to that because I do not set out to write poetry out of a sense of, I'm very sad or depressed or stressed, or because I'm so excited. I think it's a complicated, the creative process is very complicated, and the stimulus for creative writing is even more complicated. Because sometimes you have an experience that you think, is going to lead to poetry, or you think it's poetic enough that you want to capture it. And then in the process of writing it, you realize that it doesn't quite work for you the way you had imagined it. And this is something that I deal with. Sometimes a poem comes, or you believe a poem has come out of a certain experience, And the process of trying to capture it, of exploring it, it just vanishes on you, or it just dries up on you. And what do you do? And so the point that you make is a very poignant one, Chike. What do? I just allow myself to flow. Sometimes the impulse comes from reading. You have read a book, and I think some great books have that capacity to make you want to write or want to make you join the conversation. And, being a scholar myself and being one who also loves words, not just of the ones that I write, but of other poets and other writers, I find a lot of inspiration in reading books. And so my poetry is noted for its intertextual nature. Where in writing a poem based on a specific experience, I enter into intertextual conversation. I enter into conversation with other poets. However, it seems to me that if I have to wait, if I have to create a certain kind of scale, sadness, propels me more to write to poetry than joy. However, I wouldn't want to be called out on it or to hold that as a gospel truth, in terms of which is more stimulating for me to write. But I know that, when people are sad, sometimes they look for escape. And writing or reading and so many other ways. Some people escape through videos or film. Yeah, some escape through writing.
Yeah.
And then we know that psychologically, one of the ways in which certain forms of depression are treated is for people to express it.
Yes,
you are encouraged to write. You're encouraged to speak to a psychologist. You're encouraged to speak to somebody who understands the ways in which the mind works, the emotional aspects, a counselor who advises you. And then in some cases, we call it vent. You just vent. For some people, they actually encourage them as therapy to get into somewhere, there's a room where you just go and you smash things. Rather than smashing somebody's head because you feel so pent up. Then you get into the room and just smash things. It could just be a wall, and then you're just emptying your anger. And then it becomes very therapeutic. I believe in the therapeutic power of writing, and especially of poetry. Because there are moments where you are dealing with your demons, and by the time you have exorcised them, and I mean in the finest sense and the literary sense of the word exorcist, writing can be a form of exorcism. And then when you have exorcised this, you have some kind of relief, and then you just feel yourself calm down. And then later, you're going to look at it, because sometimes the raw anger, might be just too much for you to process, and then so when you write this stuff, the first instance, you still have to revisit it. So the process of editing comes in again, and the process of weighing, how do these lines stand? What's going to do? I mean, I think I was too angry when I wrote this. The feeling is so raw. I'm not so sure, because in many cases, I believe that sublimity is the echo of a noble spirit. And in processing them, even when there's anger in them, you've got to find ways. Otherwise, it just becomes, in some cases, bare words just standing there without necessarily echoing the feeling and that finesse, that constitutes great art. I know that some people who have read my poetry, especially a section of Voices in the Rainbow, have said that, there was a lot of anger in it. Yes, there was anger. I wrote some of those things when I was a very hungry journalist in dealing with, I've just left school. I was in Lagos trying to get into things. And that for a long time, Nigeria just hasn't quite worked. And it takes a lot of anger management, as a matter of fact, to write about certain aspects of the Nigerian experience. I've been shot point blank. I have not written about it in any poem. But I have been stabbed, and that gave inspiration for The Night Hides with a Knife. So I bear scars, from living in my homeland. Some of it, really near-death experiences. And so you just don't go out there and begin to spill, like a molten magma. You just find yourself just spilling like that, and then burning everything around you with your words. Sometimes that works. At other times, they need to be processed, like that. It's like raw meat. You're not just throwing out red meat. You also think that, oh yeah, some people don't like red meat. I got to create a balance as much as
balance,
possible
right.
without necessarily lying to my experience. You know, so you'll see that sometimes the poets who manage even to the rawest of feelings and experiences impose form on it, like impose something like what would be one of the most rigorous forms, a sonnet. You have found this in some love poems, in the metaphysical poets, sometimes the classical poets. You know, EKG, Ikogo, for example, has the Hesiod, you know, which is a very long, you know, using some of the classical forms of poetry to deal with otherwise very raw contemporary experiences. It's all a matter of style and how you want to process it. So I can't easily say, you know, which is dominant in terms of my poetic inspiration, but I can think in terms of how I process them. And I leave the work to speak for itself as much as possible. But in all, I want to be very true and very, very true to my experience without necessarily trying to fake it, without necessarily trying to mellow it down to the extent that it no longer has the effect. So you will see lines in Voices in the Rainbow that just talks about born, rubber born. And I can actually just show you a bit from this. The sequence, one of the sequences that open the poem in Voices in the Rainbow, and then this, the images take wing, another section. Rhapsody of a Lunatic. So this subsection is the Rhapsody of a Lunatic. And then it's for Ken for Nigeria. This was shortly after Ken Sari was hanging. And then it begins, sometimes, you know, you also capture that street language. I love street stories and I love street laws. And I tried sometimes to capture these. I see myself more as a poet of the street. Who can stop these bullets of decadence flying in my country? Who can heal these wounds inflicted on my homeland? I wake up every morning thinking of sorrows, tears, and blood. I wake up sweeping my lens across this terrain, chained by tin gods and mammon, bullets and ballots. I wake up each day crying until a scarlet sun sets in my eyes, mocking this plague that rules the nation. Who can heal this bleeding ulcer inflicted on my homelands, on my country's resources? And then it goes on to the other section that begins, galloping in the shadows. Who should sing with, you should sing with Pablo, my country people. He sees you fermenting under the skin of my love. He sees you sulking like dust before the rain. And you say you don't love me, galloping away in the gallows, cherishing my presence is hugging me in your dreams like the fence encircling a palm tree in the botanical gardens. And the third section opens with, you sit inside the Tower of Babel looking at the wanton hangmen lost in a feast of hangings. All you do is to think of fascist repression and of dark clouds gathering in the low sky. Then you sing with the radio. Me, I love my country. I love the land and people. Everything it did for Nigeria. Maybe join hands to make Nigeria better. No, 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 send folks. Sing with Neruda, sing with Ken. Sing of poverty and the rape of the earth, of old dresses and worn-out shoes. Sing of poverty and barren marketplaces. Earthmen, you fear too much, even wind rushes through your windows, nothing's frightening you. And you say, I've seen women rioting about, down the devil in uniform, crucify his serpentine desires. I've seen Amazons rout imperial lackeys in Doheny. Or you sit, watching this generation suffer death by hanging, and you say you love your dear homeland. And I just take the opening lines of the fourth sequence, soul of my madness. Burn, rubber, burn, flames, inferno, burn, gas flames, scorching earth, burn. Mayflowers of pride of Barbados. My word steals your inertia as you say apathy is your name. No longer Nana the toxic man. You charm me like beggars hollering across tinted glasses of limousines at crossroads.
Wow.
You amuse me, saying I speak in learned tongues, alluding to Pablo the poet. Bearing our tattered lives before the world, but your pockets smell like the local corpse's pockets. Your palms itch in anticipation of another bribe. Grubber! Your name now is a Gunje. Your face, like the dictator's face, is corrugated with rust. And I, poet of the hanged generation, now chant you Tamsi, the Congo man. Chant of the thick of your soul. chant of dancing when you're sad. So you can see that's the anger is there, but there's also a certain sense and a certain struggle. Yeah, that's a word. To process this raw feeling. You can't. Living in Nigeria is like sometimes, and Chinua said that living in Lagos is like living in a war front. And that wasn't a documentary. And, you can write about roses in the war front, but you can write about roses. But those roses might become bullets. And it will take the reader to process those kinds of expressions of the deepest feelings of heart that have been converted into poetry. So, Chike, I hope this is like a long answer, but I'm happy that you asked this because it gives me opportunity to deal with something that is so central to my poetry, and I think to a lot of, the work that poets do, with regard to sadness and joy as stimuli for writing poetry.
Whoa, Prof, I don't even know what to say again. Those 2 points are intriguing. They are interesting. They are interesting to listen to. That is wonderful. Those points are wonderful. So, does anybody still have a question to ask, audience?
Okay, D, your audio connection seems weak. Go
okay.
ahead and type your.
You can type your question, please.
Okay, I can see his question on the chat.
Okay.
What's the place of the spiritual in African poetry? It seems that modern African poetry focuses more on the personal and terrestrial. But reading your works, it almost feels like a throwback to those times when African mysticism, mythology, and the metaphysical were integral to African poetry and literature. Whoosh. D, thanks for that. That's both a question and a comment, and I'm going to deal with it in that way. That's the way I understand it. It's both a question and a comment. It says, what's the place of the spiritual in African poetry? This term, I taught, we just finished first semester classes, and then we're in an exam period right now at Carleton University here in Canada. And one of the courses I taught this term is African Literatures 1. And I thought part of it is an introductory course, even if it's at second year, Introduction to African Literature 1. That's basically what it is, even if introduction is not put in there. So I thought about how to organize a course in a way that would allow me to teach the students. Not teach. Teach is always a very pretentious term for me because it presupposes a certain kind of authority that is quote unquote the teacher or the professor doesn't always have. Because in certain topics and certain aspects of the engagement in the classroom, there could be students in that class who know far more than the professor on those topics. And so let's say engagements. So I prefer the term teaching and learning. And in that kind of environment, it allows us to enter into conversations about topics. So one of the models that I taught, one of the subtopics was what you just talked about, D. I looked at myth, the role of myth in African literature, the supernatural. And, some of the poems, so I taught Wole Soyinka's Abiku, J.P. Clark's Abiku, and then I went through some other poems to illustrate the role of the spiritual in African spiritualities and African worldview, and how this is how this is represented and how this has influenced African literature generally. Yes, what has happened with some of the contemporary writers is that they do not necessarily have that kind of connection to these kinds of mysticism or the supernatural. So in my poetry, for example, I recognize these totems, and I think it's partly the influence of my love of oral literature, and then of traditional literature, and of our own cultural poetics and cultural experience. I fancy myself when I'm talking and just want to goof around. I said, look, I'm a local international man, or you can flip it. I'm an international local man. So these days people use the word local to represent it. And so some people say, Nduka, you're always sporting African attire and all of that. Where did you get all of this from? And I said, well, this is part of my cultural identity. You know, I grew up the first years of my life, the early part of my life, I was known as Tony, and it remains my name. But at a certain point, as I grew in cultural consciousness, you know, I began to win a way to it. My old classmates still call me by, and I answer it and I appreciate it. But I also began to understand more the significance of our cultural values. So the supernatural is something, the spiritual. In fact, if you live in a country like Canada and you see the experience of the indigenous people, you would have to make that almost inevitably that connection exists, where we have relationship between the living and the dead. And we also have cultural practices that are embedded in our own forms of spiritualities, especially before Christianity was introduced into our continent. And then it just looks like in my writing then, and I'm happy that you recognized that and you saw this, is that I use this a lot as much as possible. I use the call and response. If you remember, my undergraduate essay thesis was on a local oral performance group, storytelling group in my hometown in Oshuku. My master's thesis was on a spectacular oral artist called Neke Mama from Ubuluku. My PhD thesis deals with street stories in Africa, and I go on to theorize what I call street stories and how these are circulated, and how they also are transformed into different forms of cultural production in Africa. And then, so in all of this, I have come to terms very early on through my academic research on the significance of African spiritualities on myth. Amongst the books that I have here, you can't easily miss, okay, this section here. You know, you can't miss this. There's an entire section here is on my oral literature text, and this is myth in Africa. So, and I have quite a number of these books, which has served as a foundation of much of the work that I have done, or that I continue to do. So it almost feels like a throwback. Perhaps that's the way you feel about that mysticism. And so I begin Displace, just to tie up my discussion here. The first poem in this book is this new book. Today time is, this is the first poem on page 3. Today time is the eyeglass I wear. That's the title of this poem. It says, today time is the eyeglass I wear. The purple rim masks the scars of the years, and the lenses periscope the joys of my soul. Look, you will find a window to hidden treasures, every peep a kaleidoscope of experience and an invitation to share secrets of the Most High. Come, and you will find me at the altar of time, incense on my left, Ikenga on my right. Come with your own totems, worship with me. So for me, poetry is spiritual. Poetry is worship. And, you know, the Ikenga is no longer an idol, which, you know, the Christian teaching makes of some of these traditional forces, some of these mystical elements and symbols, but something that connotes, you know, far more relevance to our lives. And the other part I will end in is that we can't prescribe to writers what they're going to write about, whether they're going to continue with mysticism. Even to B.C. Martins decides, oh, okay, I'm going to have I have a more contemporary approach. Or if Esnachi says, oh no, I'm going to just deal with the social experience in the city of Lagos or in contemporary African cities, or Samuel Pinero or Mina Obanga. Any of you here who are working, who write, you know, have the right to choose their topic and how to go about it. So if we do not have a whole lot of that mysticism and spirituality, which we find laced in the modern, what we describe as early modern African poetry, then it's not so much a weakness as it might be, as also a reflection of the contemporaneous experience of the writers. However, I believe that one way that we can create authenticity and lend, that kind of special voice and context to our work is also to reclaim these aspects of African spirituality as best we can. However, we decide to do it, to be left to different writers to mediate.
So thank you, Prof, for that nice explanation. Really do appreciate. And there is no much time, and I know you have some place to go, and won't like to delay you much. So, lastly, please, where can we get a copy of this book, your recent published book, Displace?
Okay, that's a very big question. It's a short question. It's a very simple question, but it's also big. It's big in the sense that the short answer is that you can get it on Amazon. Right? But the big response is that we also know what has happened to the Naira and how much these books that are in dollars. This one is not, I don't even say that. But it's like around $19, and if you converted it, then you add shipping and all other things.
Yeah.
So right now, fortunately, this book, I have the Nigerian rights for this book, and so it's scheduled to be published in Nigeria.
Okay.
But at the same time, we also know what constitutes the difficulties of publishing in Nigeria. And especially for somebody who doesn't live at home. Already I've been discussing with you about the mechanics for distribution.
Yes.
Because it doesn't make any sense to invest a lot to publish a book that you just dumped in one corner and is not sold. Yeah. Or that you just completely giving out to friends, as a number of guys do. Yeah. Writing is meant also, besides the fulfillment that comes from it, which I think is a first benefit. Yeah. It's also meant to enable the writer to be able to buy beer and wine. And so if it's published and all of that investment is made and you don't even recoup any part of it, then it becomes some kind of loss. So it is important that one pays attention to the distribution. Yeah. And that as people of the literary community, we value and treasure the need to buy books, not to solicit for free copies from authors. Because it means that for every book they publish, besides the fulfillment of having the books published, they also will suffer losses and not being able to pay their bills. And so based on that, I am making every effort. And then given the logistical challenges that I face living here, I think that in the very near future, you should be able to have this in the bookstores when we have the Nigerian edition of it published. And then also have the other books that are basically available on Amazon, now, which many of you can access. There's also some of my other books on Kobo Books, right? Is that what it's called? And some other Nigerian platforms. So you can get them now by ordering them online. But I am working to see that they can also be more easily available through the bookstores and the local online distribution chain.
Yeah, that would be very wonderful if we can get a copy down to Nigeria, and that is the hard copy. It's more better for people who want to really get. I like recently I pasted if you remember, I pasted that the cover on our front page on our website. A lot of people were asking me, how can I get a copy of the book? I was like, okay, go to Amazon. I just directed them to Amazon, the link you gave to me. So I directed them. I don't know if any of them have ordered do, because most of them are outside the country and here in Nigeria as well. So it would be much better if a copy can be brought to Libretto bookstores or other bookstores, so that people
then you get a copy. I'm accept this invitation. I had to do it.
Yeah.
Nothing could be more gratifying to see startups like yours.
Yeah.
Who are, as it were, actually lifting very rough stones, without gloves and without any special protection.
Yeah.
That is what it's like the business environment can be in Nigeria. More so one that has to do with intellectual ideas or intellectual
property,
property,
yeah,
or even products.
Yeah.
So you deserve every support that we should be able to lend.
Oh, thank you.
And then I do hope that as you continue this project and continue on this journey, all of us will join in having to make Nigerians understand about the need to buy local. We might live abroad, but I also fancy myself as a great ambassador of my country and of our culture. And it's one of the reasons I love my African traditional motifs that I wear.
Okay.
Even if I'm not sporting that today. And I want to say that here, despite the big presence of these bookstores, we still have a consciousness to support local bookstores.
Yeah.
You know, so you have these small bookstores, and as a professor, for example, I prefer to recommend books to be bought from these small bookstores to support them. Otherwise, the conglomerates in Canada is Chapters and Indigo are all over the place. You have Barnes and Noble.
Yeah.
So it means that the corner bookstores, the community bookstores, will all cease to exist. They'll be run out by the global multinationals. And so this is the importance of supporting the kind of business that you're doing, because I see it as going beyond commerce, but also something that is tied to partner. That has to do with contributing to the growth of our culture and of our ideas. So I will congratulate you, Jide, and other members of your board, including D.
Yeah.
D is a fantastic graphic designer.
Very good one.
Graphic artist.
Very good
As
one.
a matter of fact, D designed the cover of this book.
Yeah, I know.
Incredible.
Yeah,
D,
he's amazing.
I can't thank you enough. You're a very talented creative artist. And all of you who were there, I thank you. And some of my friends who joined, I want to thank you a lot, including my very good friend Mina, who is joined from Port Harcourt. I want to thank you. And I also know that you do a lot of amazing work in promoting books and other things, in addition to being a professor at University of Port Harcourt. Thank you all for joining us this morning, and I really appreciate this opportunity to share with you my ideas and to share with you some of the things that are right. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Prof. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.